Externalities and public goods. That is the topic for today, in case you've ever been curious about either of these. All right, so first, let's review a little bit about what we already know about supply and demand. These models allow us to identify how much of goods and services to produce and how much to charge. Now, with supply and demands, there are buyers, there are sellers. But within the transaction, there is a buyer and a seller, and they're the only ones that we capture, or they're the only ones whose cost and benefits we capture in this model. What if there are situations where there are other costs or other benefits beyond the buyer and the seller of this particular transaction? Let's consider that. So here we have some ripple effects and a couple to think about. First of all, imagine you are opening a meditation center and right next door a Harley Davidson practice ground opens. So you think about these really loud motorcycles and they're going to be going around the track in the back all day, every day. Do you think your business will be impacted? You see, this is something that the supply and demand model doesn't really account for. Secondly, imagine you own a home and right behind your house, imagine the difference between a park being behind there or a fertilizer plant. Which will impact your life better? Which will have a more positive impact on your home value? Important questions to consider. So first, let's give a definition of an externality. So when you consider the transaction between a buyer and a seller, there could be one of two situations. There could be benefits to others besides the buyer and the seller, and that are not included in the price. Or there could be harm to others besides the buyer and the seller, not included in the costs. With positive externalities, the first scenario, the problem is that society or that the market may underproduce. Or if there are negative externalities, the market may overproduce. Two problems, and we'll talk about some potential solutions. First, some like real-world examples of potential externalities and questions that we should answer. First, should polluters be responsible for cleaning up a mess that affects others? This is an externality question. How often do our decisions impact other people? Was Newton or Leibniz adequately compensated for inventing calculus, considering that, almost everything that we use today requires calculus? How many billions, if not trillions of dollars were made on the backs of Newton and Leibniz? Were they adequately compensated for this? And what about the inventor of the first pizza? Was that person adequately compensated? How do we allocate resources for public goods? The last question. And that will trigger an important conversation about public goods, which are a very, very special type of usually a positive externality. So a couple of attributes of public goods. First of all, by nature, they are non-rivalrous, which means that if you use the public good, it doesn't preclude other people from also using it. A good example of this would be a state park. Many people can enjoy the park at the same time. It's not like, if I'm wearing a shirt, then other people cannot wear the same shirt. Also non-exclusive. If we're going to continue with the state park example, it's really hard to create barriers to prevent people from using the state park. The last point, which is the most important for us as economists, is that this non-rivalry and non-exclusivity creates potential for problems, namely who pays for public goods when everybody can use the public goods. And this creates what's called a free rider problem. If any of you have ever been part of group projects where the group gets a collective grade and someone doesn't do any work, you're familiar with the free rider problem. Now that brings us very quickly to the conversation about quasi-public goods. So public goods, there is no exclusion, no barriers. So think about defense would be a public good. Or, well, defense may be the only public good, like serious public good that I can think of right now off the top of my head, but there are others. Actually, more often than not, public goods fall into the domain of quasi-public goods, meaning that there's some exclusion, there's some, elements of barriers, but it also shares characteristics with public goods. Now, quasi-public goods, it's easier to understand this as examples. So roads, most people use roads, but not everybody drives. So there's a quasi-public good. Also, libraries and education. Think about libraries. If I'm taking out a book, it excludes somebody else from taking the book out. We need to share. Education. Not everybody goes to school. Most people do, but not everybody. So some people benefit from education, but not necessarily everybody. Although you can make the case that, let's say I don't have children, but I am financially supporting the public school. Well, there is a public benefit to having other people's children be educated. If they're going to school, they're not going to be, throwing eggs at my house, for example, or causing mischief. So even with quasi-public goods, there are some benefits for people to help finance these, even if they're not a direct beneficiary. Now, the more that the government finances public goods, the fewer private goods can be produced. This creates a little bit of a problem. Now, there are some ideas about how to pay for or how to finance public goods. A big problem is that because these are not in the domain of markets, it's very hard to create market solutions when it comes to pricing and how much to produce. In this case, surveys, community meetings, data are beneficial to estimate how much of a public good should be provided and who should finance. What role do communities have when it comes to financing or deciding about public goods? And what about voting? Now, if there are problems when it comes to either public goods or negative externalities, there is a theory, the Coase theory, that suggests that private contracts and bargaining can provide solutions without the need for governments to interfere. Now, there are some disagreements about whether Coase theorem actually works in real life or how well it works. It does require there to be low transaction costs as part of the original theorem, but this is an important point that there are some problems that can be solved privately through individuals when it comes to public goods and or externalities. So I will throw this there as well. Now, another big problem in the literature with public goods is overuse. If any of you are familiar, there was a book written several years ago. I think maybe in the early 90s, if I had to guess. It's a book by Jared Diamond called Collapse. And there are certain theories in the book I don't particularly agree with, but there are a lot that I do. Either way, it's fascinating his topic on how certain societies collapse. And some of his research, he describes many ancient societies having collapsed because they were not good at managing overuse of natural resources. Countries that have survived inadvertently or usually would be much better at managing resources well. So let's take a look at this example. Imagine a lake where everyone has equal access to fish in the lake. Well, if people are trying to make a living in the lake, they may have a tendency to overfish, which affects all others. The more fish I catch, the less there may be fish for others to also fish. And a solution to overuse are restrictions, and this is why most states, if not all states, have regulations for both fishing and hunting to protect natural resources so that everybody can enjoy them. And this is very common, and these restrictions are done by communities themselves to police themselves so that uh, there's mutual benefit for everyone, that everyone can enjoy these public resources. Now, let's say there are both positive or negative externalities. We're going to take a look at how to graph these using our supply and demand models in just a moment. But it's also important to know what government tools there are in the case of a negative externality to lower the supply or for a positive externality to increase the demand. And there are two major types. There are command and control policies, which involve price controls, like minimum wage, and there are some issues with price controls. Remember, back in the beginning when we talked about supply and demand, if you don't remember, please go back. Whenever you have a price control above or below our equilibrium price, you have problems with either overages, or they're also called surpluses sometimes, on the one end, and shortages on the other ends. And we usually don't like overages or shortages. So, are there other policies? Well, yes, there are. There are also market-based solutions, and usually these take the form of taxes and subsidies. For a homework assignment or for a quiz, you will need to distinguish both of these. And by the way, just a refresher, a tax is when the government takes money from people. A subsidy is when the government gives money back to people. So this is why taxes are used to discourage negative externalities, and subsidies are used to encourage positive ones. Now, some firms are protected from competition, and this can create a rent-seeking situation. So be cautious from a policy perspective on using subsidies or taxes because it can create a situation where companies can take advantage and um, seek rent-seeking behavior, which involves profits above and beyond economic profits. And this is usually considered to be an inefficient use of resources from an economics perspective. So here we have our model. We're almost done. We have a model of, the fact that costs, when it comes to externalities, the costs are not captured in the individual transaction between the buyer and the seller. In this example, we have a private marginal cost, but there's also a public marginal cost. Usually the example is pollution, and this can be noise pollution in the Harley-Davidson example I had earlier, or if you've ever had a noisy roommate or a noisy neighbor, then you know that their benefit and costs of playing loud music does not include your cost of not getting enough sleep, which is not fair to you. So usually pollution is a good example of how there's a cost, a public cost that's not factored into the original equations. So in this example of noise pollution, we have a private benefit for a local band to practice at night. Let's say that that's the only time the band can play. However, neighbors incur a public cost, which is lack of sleep. How can the market come to solve this issue. So when it comes to negative externalities, we're going to use the supply and demand model, and demand will represent the private and public benefit, whereas supply, in this case, is only considering the private cost of the band. The band has a cost of practicing, time out of their day, time away from their families, but there's an additional cost that's not considered here. And so a tax, or in this case, maybe a fee or fine or restriction, would shift the supply curve to the left, and we would have a better equilibrium point. And by the way, we can also apply consumer and producer surplus to these two equilibrium points. So you can actually see that with the new equilibrium point, there are actually benefits that outweigh the original equilibrium points. So that will be a homework assignment for you guys, or a class assignment that we'll take a look at together. But for now, I just want to show you how to model these graphically. And for a positive externality, what we're saying here is that we want the demand curve, the society demand curve, that's not captured in the private demand curve. So in this example, we're talking about education. We want the demand curve to move to the right. We can actually do this through the use of government subsidies. So in the previous example, a negative externality requires taxes, a positive one is going to require subsidies. And that was a lot of talking, but I hope that you enjoyed learning about externalities. There are a lot of policy implications when it comes to externalities, both positive and negative. And there's also a lot more that we could talk about when it comes to public goods and how societies determine about public goods. And so that's it for now.